The flight had started like any other, a long-haul international route, hundreds of passengers, and a crew meticulously going through the safety checks while the hum of the engines created a false sense of calm. I, a black CEO with a reputation for leading one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world, had settled into my seat, quietly preparing for the hours ahead. I was accustomed to travel, to long flights, to navigating airports with efficiency, but nothing could have prepared me for the shock of that moment. Out of nowhere, a flight attendant, visibly irritated and twitchy, approached my seat. At first, I thought she was simply enforcing an airline policy, but the moment she leaned in, I realized this was personal. Without warning, she slapped me across the face. The cabin fell silent. Gasps erupted from passengers around me, phones discreetly raised to record the scene, and children instinctively clutched their parents' hands. "Your attitude isn't welcome here," she muttered under breath, as if the slap itself had been a form of authority. I blinked once, stunned, feeling a rush of adrenaline coursing through me. Not anger, but clarity. This was a violation of everything professional and legal, a blatant abuse of power by someone who thought she could assert control over me mid-flight. I stayed calm, taking a deep breath and centering myself, even as whispers and murmurs began circulating throughout the cabin. My immediate priority was safety for myself, for the passengers, and for the flight crew, who were suddenly caught in a volatile situation. I knew this was more than a simple altercation. It had the potential to spiral into chaos if mishandled. I discreetly reached for the in-flight communication system and requested the captain to connect me to the airline's control center on the ground. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's smirk faded slightly as she realized she was being recorded, even if the passengers didn't yet understand the severity of her mistake. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted. I sent a secure message to my executive team, activating an emergency protocol they had prepared for such unexpected crises. Meanwhile, the captain, sensing the tension, kept the cabin calm while maintaining communication with air traffic control and ground operations. Passengers began taking discreet videos, whispering to each other and glancing nervously at the altercation, realizing that what had started as an isolated incident could escalate. The flight attendant, trying to maintain control, made several more gestures toward me, but every move only amplified the evidence against her. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her increasingly erratic behavior, drawing the attention of every observer in the cabin. By the time we were halfway through the flight, the situation had evolved into more than just a slap. It had become a test of authority, composure, and strategic response. Passengers were on edge, subtly watching every interaction, while the flight crew whispered among themselves, unsure how to handle the fallout. I knew that within 10 minutes, this incident could either be contained professionally or spiral into a full-blown corporate and public relations disaster. My priority was clarity and control, and I was already preparing the steps to ensure that justice would be served without compromising safety. The flight attendant, who had thought she was wielding authority, had no idea that her actions would ignite a chain reaction capable of shattering an entire airline's credibility, and that realization, when it finally came, would be far too late. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered, their eyes flicking nervously between me and the flight attendant, who was now visibly shaken, her earlier confidence replaced with confusion and panic. I had already discreetly activated my executive team on the ground, sending them the details of the incident, video evidence from passengers, and a preliminary assessment of potential corporate and legal implications. Within minutes, my team had mobilized, contacting legal counsel, media specialists, and regulatory advisors. They were preparing to handle what had rapidly evolved into a situation that could potentially bankrupt or at least humiliate the airline if not addressed properly. Meanwhile, the flight attendant attempted to regain control, walking briskly through the aisles and insisting passengers follow certain instructions, but every move she made now appeared petty and erratic. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. No one trusted her authority anymore. Even the captain, seated calmly in the cockpit, could feel the tension and was keeping a careful record of the unfolding drama to report to ground control. I remained composed, projecting calm and control as I prepared to escalate matters officially once the plane landed. I quietly instructed the crew to maintain order and avoid confrontation, while I made note of every detail, her words, her gestures, and the reactions of passengers. Cameras were discreetly raised from phones, and I could see that the flight attendant was now aware of the scrutiny she was under. Every action, every slip, every raised voice was being documented without her realizing the full extent. It was clear that the airline had failed in multiple ways. Poor crew training, lack of conflict resolution procedures, and inadequate oversight allowed this type of behavior to escalate to a critical level. I knew that the combination of evidence, witnesses, and proper legal protocol would leave them exposed, and that within hours the consequences would ripple far beyond this single flight. Passengers, now fully aware that something serious was happening, began whispering and recording, creating an ever-growing pool of evidence. The flight attendants' earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by frantic attempts to maintain composure, but it was too late. Social media channels were already buzzing with real-time updates from the plane as passengers shared images and short videos, creating an instant digital footprint that would amplify the impact once on the ground. The airline's control center, notified by my team, was beginning to experience panic as executives scrambled to understand the situation. Internal calls were being made, messages forwarded, and emergency procedures initiated. Their systems designed for efficiency were now overwhelmed by a problem they hadn't anticipated. A single flight incident escalating into a potential multi-billion-dollar PR nightmare. By the time the plane approached its destination, the scale of the incident had shifted from an isolated onboard conflict to a full-blown corporate crisis. Every move the flight attendant had made now contributed to a mountain of evidence. The airline's internal hierarchy, from the crew to the executives, had no plan to contain the fallout effectively. I calmly reviewed the details once more, knowing that when we landed, the chain reaction I had already set in motion would trigger resignations, fines, legal actions, and media scrutiny. In those tense minutes, it became clear that what had started as a slap was now the spark that would ignite a crisis, exposing incompetence, arrogance, and systemic failures across the airline. The flight attendant had underestimated her passenger, the passengers had become unwitting witnesses to history, and I had orchestrated with precision and patience the beginning of a collapse that no one aboard or at the control center would ever forget. As the plane began its descent, a tense silence filled the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the flight attendant, whose composure was crumbling by the minute, and me, the very passenger she had assaulted. Whispers turned into murmurs, and phones discreetly continued to record every movement. The flight attendant's earlier arrogance had completely dissolved. She was now visibly panicked, her every attempt to assert control met with cold stares and hushed disapproval from both passengers and fellow crew members. I remained calm, projecting authority without aggression, knowing that the next moments would determine not only the resolution of this incident, but also the beginning of a cascade of consequences for the airline. I had already coordinated with my corporate team on the ground, ensuring legal counsel, PR specialists, and regulatory authorities were prepared for immediate action upon landing. The airline, entirely unaware of the magnitude of the storm heading their way, was about to face a perfect storm of public scrutiny, regulatory oversight, and shareholder pressure. When the plane touched down, airport security was already briefed and waiting based on my prior coordination with ground authorities. The flight attendant, now realizing she had no escape from accountability, hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. I followed standard protocol, remaining professional while clearly demonstrating that the assault was being taken seriously. Passengers, having witnessed the incident firsthand, were eager to provide statements and share the videos they had captured. The evidence was overwhelming, and the flight attendant could see the scale of her mistake for the first time. As security escorted her away, she struggled to maintain dignity, but every step was documented, every stumble recorded. The reality was sinking in. This was no ordinary complaint, and the ramifications would be massive. Meanwhile, at the airline's control center, chaos erupted. Executives received emergency notifications detailing a mid-flight assault on a high-profile CEO, complete with passenger recordings, regulatory alerts, and legal documentation. Panic set in as they realized that the incident could not be contained quietly. Shareholders demanded explanations, media teams prepared for public fallout, and legal departments scrambled to assess potential liability. The airline's PR department issued a generic statement that did little to quell the growing storm of public outrage. Social media was already flooded with firsthand accounts, clips from passengers, and commentary that painted the airline as negligent, unprofessional, and incapable of handling critical situations. Within hours, what had been a contained onboard incident had transformed into a full-scale corporate crisis. As the initial reports and videos spread, stock prices began to fluctuate, major partners requested emergency briefings, and internal communications were flooded with urgent directives. The flight attendant, who had once thought she was asserting authority, became a symbol of corporate failure. Every action she had taken was now under scrutiny, her career hanging in the balance. By the time the plane was fully unloaded, the airline was facing regulatory investigations, legal threats, and intense media scrutiny, all triggered by a single impulsive slap. What began as a moment of unprovoked aggression had become the catalyst for a multi-layered collapse, exposing systemic weaknesses in training, oversight, and leadership that no amount of damage control could instantly repair. And through it all, I remained composed, observing, documenting, and preparing for the next steps in ensuring accountability. The morning after the incident, the airline's executives were still reeling. News reports had spread overnight. Social media was ablaze with passenger footage, and hashtags condemning the airline were trending worldwide. The slap had gone viral, transforming from a personal affront into a public relations catastrophe that threatened the airline's credibility, stock value, and operational stability. Investors demanded immediate explanations, regulatory agencies contacted the company for statements, and legal departments scrambled to assess liability and risk exposure. Internally, employees were panicked. Crew members were questioning policies and training protocols, while middle management struggled to understand how a routine flight could produce such catastrophic fallout. It became immediately clear that the airline had no prepared response for an incident of this magnitude. Every system they relied upon for operational efficiency and crisis management had failed when confronted with real-world accountability. Meanwhile, I coordinated with my legal and corporate teams to ensure that all documentation, video evidence, and eyewitness accounts were submitted to the appropriate authorities. I drafted a formal complaint with regulatory oversight agencies, highlighting not only the assault but the systemic failures within the airline's management structure. My team also began engaging media partners to ensure accurate reporting, avoiding sensationalism while emphasizing accountability and justice. The airline's executives, by contrast, were forced into reaction mode, issuing generic apologies that rang hollow and only fueled public outrage. The passengers, many of whom had shared their recordings online, became key amplifiers of the story, each upload further undermining the airline's attempts to contain the situation. Within hours, the narrative was clear. The airline had allowed negligence and mismanagement to escalate into outright misconduct, putting both passengers and corporate reputation at risk. As the day progressed, regulatory officials demanded meetings, audits, and corrective actions. Stockholders began to question leadership competence, with some calling for resignations of key personnel responsible for training and oversight. The airline's internal chaos intensified. Staff meetings turned into panic-driven huddles, while legal counsel prepared for potential lawsuits that could cost billions. Every decision the airline had made to avoid accountability backfired spectacularly, with management realizing too late that a single act of aggression by a flight attendant had exposed deep structural flaws. Meanwhile, passengers and the general public remained engaged, sharing commentary, analyzing video evidence, and demanding justice for the CEO and accountability for the airline. By evening, the airline faced a crisis the scale of which few could have predicted. Their stock had dropped significantly, regulators were issuing formal warnings, and social media continued to highlight failures in training, supervision, and leadership. Internally, the executives were scrambling to contain fallout, but the truth was undeniable. The airline had exposed systemic incompetence and a culture that tolerated misconduct. Amid the chaos, I remained composed, reviewing every piece of evidence, tracking regulatory developments, and preparing the next phase of accountability. What had begun as a mid flight slap had now evolved into a complete corporate reckoning, and the airline was learning the hard way that negligence and arrogance have consequences that extend far beyond a single incident. Within 48 hours, the airline was in full crisis mode. Regulators demanded immediate action, major investors called emergency meetings, and the media coverage intensified with each passing minute. Social media had become a relentless amplifier, with passengers sharing videos and first-hand accounts that exposed both the flight attendant's assault and the airline's systemic failures. The company scrambled to issue statements, but their words rang hollow in the face of concrete evidence and viral footage. Stock prices began to plummet as confidence in leadership eroded. Employees were panicked, realizing that decades of poor training, mismanagement, and a culture of complacency had finally caught up with them. What had started as a mid-flight slap had snowballed into a multi-billion-dollar corporate disaster, and the airline had no contingency strong enough to stop it. Meanwhile, I continued to coordinate with my legal and executive teams, ensuring that every step was documented and handled professionally. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were contacted to provide statements, while regulators prepared formal investigations into both the assault and the airline's operational failures. Contracts were suspended, partnerships were reevaluated, and internal leadership struggled to maintain authority as the board convened emergency meetings to assess damage control. The flight attendant, once confident and defiant, was now a figure of public ridicule, her career hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, I maintained composure, ensuring that justice was served without compromising safety or protocol. By the end of the day, it was clear that the airline's collapse was accelerating. The incident had exposed weaknesses at every level: training, supervision, accountability, and corporate culture. Shareholders demanded resignations, internal investigations were mandated, and media outlets speculated on long-term financial repercussions. What had seemed like a minor on-board dispute had transformed into a perfect storm, demonstrating how quickly negligence and arrogance can destroy an empire when confronted by authority, evidence, and strategic action. By the sixth day after the incident, the airline was teetering on the edge of collapse. Stock prices had plunged further, contracts with major partners were suspended, and internal chaos had reached a fever pitch. Executives and board members were forced into emergency meetings, trying desperately to patch holes in leadership, operations, and public trust, but it was too late. Regulators were issuing fines, demanding audits, and threatening severe sanctions, while social media and news outlets continued to spotlight every failure. Passengers' videos, statements, and viral posts had made the airline's negligence undeniable. The flight attendant who had slapped me was suspended pending investigation, but her actions had become a symbol of systemic failures, proof that the airline had tolerated misconduct at every level. Meanwhile, I coordinated with my legal team to ensure all evidence was secure and every regulatory complaint was properly filed. My executive team was actively monitoring developments, preparing for potential lawsuits, and managing public statements. Passengers who had witnessed the incident provided detailed accounts, amplifying the narrative of incompetence and lack of accountability. Every failed policy, every oversight, and every weak training program was now public knowledge. The airline's PR attempts to minimize the damage were futile. The public was outraged, investors were panicking, and employees were demoralized. By the evening, the airline had already begun grounding certain flights, and operational staff were reassigned as leadership struggled to regain control. Internal communications revealed resignations and forced departures among mid-level management, while regulatory bodies prepared long-term investigations into corporate culture and employee conduct. What had begun as a mid-flight assault had snowballed into a full-scale corporate implosion. And through it all, I remained composed, ensuring that every action taken was strategic, professional, and meticulously documented. The airline, which had underestimated a single passenger, now faced consequences that would reshape its leadership, operations, and reputation for years to come. By the seventh day, the airline was effectively in shambles. The board had resigned en masse, major investors were withdrawing support, and the regulatory investigations were intensifying. Flights were being canceled, operations scaled back, and employees remained on edge, fearful of further public scrutiny and potential layoffs. The viral footage of the flight attendant's assault on me had not only ruined her career, but had exposed systemic failures in training, supervision, and corporate governance that could not be ignored. News outlets were reporting daily updates, emphasizing how a single impulsive act had triggered a catastrophic corporate collapse. Shareholders demanded accountability, regulators imposed fines, and the airline's reputation was in ruins, proving that negligence and arrogance carry consequences that extend far beyond the initial moment of error. Throughout it all, I remained calm and composed, ensuring that every step I took was professional, legal, and strategic. My executive team continued to monitor developments, managing regulatory responses, legal filings, and public statements to ensure clarity and precision. Passengers who had witnessed the incident became key voices in the narrative, further amplifying the airline's failures and demanding justice. By taking measured, calculated steps instead of reacting impulsively, I ensured that accountability was enforced without compromising safety or ethical standards. The flight attendant and the airline's leadership had underestimated both the seriousness of their actions and the power of evidence and strategy, a miscalculation that had cost them everything. By the end of the week, the airline's collapse was undeniable. Contracts were lost, stock value had plummeted, executives had been terminated or resigned, and regulatory sanctions were in motion. Public confidence had evaporated entirely, and the company faced long-term reputational damage that would take years to repair. What had begun as a mid-flight slap had escalated into a perfect storm of corporate disaster, exposing decades of mismanagement, neglect, and poor leadership. And as I watched the aftermath unfold, it became abundantly clear that restraint, preparation, and strategic action are far more powerful than brute force or anger. The airline had learned the hardest lesson possible. Underestimate no one, especially a CEO prepared to hold those accountable who threaten others without reason.